I'd like you to welcome you to the 3.1 podcast. In this section, we are going to be looking at community ecology and how all living organisms are limited by factors in their environment. We're going to be looking at how unfavorable abiotic and biotic factors affect different species. We're going to talk about how a range of tolerance affects the distribution of those organisms. And as we see a change in a community, the different steps that we go through during primary and secondary succession. Now, in 3.1, we're going to revisit some of the vocabulary that we learned in section 2.1. First of all, we need to remind ourselves that abiotic and biotic, abiotic being anything not living, and biotic being things that are living. We also talked about communities. Remember, a community is a population of organisms that live in the same area, and conditions aren't always positive or negative for each of those organisms. So while you may have one group of organisms that prefer hot weather, you may have another group of organisms that would prefer it to be just a little bit cooler. So conditions that are good for one aren't always good for another. So this leads us into limiting factors. Now, limiting factors, it's just what it says. They are things that can limit where an organism can live or its ability to be successful in that environment. These limiting factors can be biotic or abiotic, so living or non-living things that can affect an organism. For example, if there's not enough water, that would be an abiotic factor. During a drought, we have limited grass growth. Now, this limiting factor, not enough water, doesn't just affect the grass. It affects all of the organisms that depend on the grass for shelter or for food. So when we have one population suffering or one population inhibited by a limiting factor, we see that that goes across other populations as well. So we have not enough water, which leads us to not enough grass, which is going to affect the mouse population, which then would affect the hawk population. So once again, a limiting factor, anything that can hurt an organism's ability to survive in that particular environment, and that when one population is affected, usually several populations are affected. Some examples of limiting factors. We have several abiotic factors that commonly are limiting: the amount of sunlight that you have, what your climate is, the temperature, how much water you get, or if you get too much or too little, the nutrients, either like in the soil for plants, or which would be abiotic, or if it's nutrients that you're getting if you're an animal by eating other things, would be biotic. Fire, the soil chemistry, whether it is too salty, not salty enough, what the pH is, how much space you have. Are you confined to a very limited area for hunting or for living, or do you have an open range? And then other living things. Are you competing with other organisms? Those symbiotic relationships that were mentioned in 2.1, mutualism, commensalism, parasitism. Are you competing with another organism for the same food supply? Are they your predator, and that limits where you can be? So many different things can be limiting factors. Now, these limiting factors affect where organisms can live. Where an organism can live is called its range of tolerance. We usually have an upper and a lower limit. It looks like a standard bell curve. I'm going to reference the figure that is on page 61 of your book. Now, here we're looking at steelhead trout, and notice we have an optimum zone right there in the middle, at the middle of our bell curve, and that is where we see the most trout, in this case between 13 degrees Celsius and 21 degrees Celsius. Now, their tolerance is the total spectrum of where they can live. So we will also see trout as low as 9 degrees Celsius, and we will see them living in environments up to 25 degrees Celsius. But we're not going to see as much. They have this lower and upper limit where they're not able to thrive as well as they could in their optimum zone. So this ability of an organism to survive is called its tolerance, and that entire area is called the range of tolerance. One of the things that happens, though, is that temperature isn't the only thing that can affect the survival of the steelhead trout, because other things happen when that temperature change. As the temperature goes up in the water, it's able to hold less oxygen. The gas isn't able to be dissolved as well. And so not only are the fish dealing with that physiological stress of being in a higher temperature, but they're also having to deal with not having enough oxygen. That temperature also can go along with how much water they have. So going back to that space concept, if the water is shallower, the temperature will be higher than if it's really deep. And so then this optimum zone is also in relation to how much space they have. How deep is that water going to be? So there's lots of things that can affect the tolerance of different organisms. We also see this when we look at pollutants, and we'll talk more about that in chapter 5. But one of the problems that we have is companies not only putting pollutants into the water, but they use it as a cooling system for their company. So they bring in cold water, they run it in conduit tubes past their hot equipment, and the heat transfers between the heat into the cold water, and then they dump the water back out into the river. And their big reasoning is, well, they're not polluting the water. They're not adding anything to the natural water supply, so they're not violating anything. Well, as we can see from this chart, if the temperature goes up, they're not polluting the water, but by changing the temperature, they're changing the organisms that can live there. So we could actually see a decrease in the different organisms that we see, because the temperature change is being created because of something that humans are doing. As we look at these ranges of tolerances, we also see changes that can happen. Any change in a community changes the populations that we see. When we think of communities, or when I think of communities, I think of, the redwood forest and some of these big forests or the deserts, things that they just always look the same. And that's not what always happens. There's a process called ecological succession. And when we think about the word succession, it just means to follow, like you succeed somebody. And so ecological succession are the changes that happen when one community replaces another community, because those limiting factors, because of the changes in abiotic and biotic factors. Now, we can have two different kinds of ecological succession depending on where we see the change happening, or when that change actually starts to occur. The first type that we're going to talk about is primary succession, and then the second type is secondary succession. Now, I want to warn you, primary and secondary succession doesn't mean that primary happens first and then secondary happens. It's just a way of, we have two different start points getting to the same end goal. Okay, so let's talk about primary succession first. In primary succession, the changes that happen is when we start at a point when there are no living organisms. In order to have living organisms, even bacteria, they need something to grow on. They need nutrients. They need a shelter. And so areas that undergo primary succession, there's not even bacteria there, or very little bacteria. And so we have to look at what would happen to cause an area that would have to go through primary succession. The most common way of having an area go through primary succession is when it starts off in rock. And that can happen several ways. Naturally, it can happen when a volcano erupts and the lava cools, and then you have barren rock that then has to be repopulated with bacteria, with lichen, and so on, and we have to break it down in order to receive dirt. Another thing that we can see with primary succession is when man-made, we cover up an area. So with all the construction that's been going on, we know that there's going to be lots of primary succession happening if for some reason the school would never be used, because we have all this new concrete. And if that area would ever get reclaimed by the environment, then the parking lots would have to go through primary succession, because there's nothing living on the parking lots already. Now, secondary succession is a little different. Secondary succession happens after the existing communities have been destroyed, but there's still dirt. So a way that secondary succession happen is if a fire would come through the forest, it wipes out everything living, but it leaves the plant roots, it leaves the soil, it leaves the bacteria in the soil, and they already kind of have that head start. So primary succession are the changes that we see when we're starting from rock. Secondary succession are the changes that we see with soil still there. And after all of our changes are done, we are going to finally end up in a climax community. Now there's a couple ways that we're going to get there. Okay, so first step is something happens. We either have a volcano explode, or we lay down concrete, or a fire comes through, but something happens. The second step that happens is we get a pioneer species. Now this is usually a lichen. It's an algae and a bacterial, very mutualistic relationship between those two. And they are going to start to break down existing rock to start to create soil. Now this is going to take a long time depending on which part of succession. Are we going through primary succession or secondary succession? If it's going through primary succession, this is going to be a very long step because these lichen are going to be responsible for starting to make new soil. We're going to have weathering, we're going to have erosion, and all of that is going to help to break down that rock and to create soil so that we have something for plants to grab onto. If we're going through secondary succession, this part of the process is going to be very, very short because we already have the soil. We really don't need to make any more, but we're going to have to replenish it. Maybe there's nutrients lost because of whatever happened. So the environment's going to have some time to recover. The third step that's going to happen is we're going to have plants appear. We're going to have short shrubs that show up that are very annual. They are going to come and then they're going to die off. And as they get to be established, they're going to become larger and larger. The fourth thing that's going to happen is we're going to start to have animals. All we need are some little shrubs, some little grasses, and we're going to start to have mice come in. Once we get little animals, larger animals follow. As the grasses get bigger, we're going to have bigger herbivores show up. And as soon as the animals get big enough, we'll start to have some of those big carnivores come in. So we're going to gradually see that change. And then the very last step, when all of the change is done, we have a climax community. Now this is a stable environment. There's not a lot of change going on. So like at the beginning when I said, when I think of communities and those big established communities, I think of the redwoods and I think of the Sahara Desert and the rainforest. Those are climax communities. Those trees did not get that large overnight. They've had hundreds of years in order to get that large. So that is the climax community. Usually there's no new growth. We don't have a lot of little plants. We don't have a lot of little trees. The only time we would see those things is when like a big tree would fall down and then the smaller ones will take its place. And we'll actually get to see an example of that when we watch Planet Earth. For the most part, climax communities are very stable. There's no new organisms coming in. The only time we would see a new organism coming in is if it would be transplanted there or brought in by humans. But if it's indigenous to the area, if it's naturally found there, if it's a climax community, we're not going to see anything new. Okay, and just a couple pictures to let you see. Notice in primary succession, once again, we are starting off with rock, so like a volcanic eruption. We're going to have to use those pioneer species in order to get dirt. We're going to start to have small trees, or small bushes, small trees. They're going to lead way to the bigger trees. They're going to block out the sun, so now we're going to need shade-tolerant trees and bushes. And the larger the trees get, the less of the smaller bushes we get. Down in secondary succession, we already have dirt established, so we're going to just start right away with getting those small bushes, the small organisms, and then we're gradually going to work our way up once again to a climax community.